This is a continuation of The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli, comprising chapters 20 to 26 and the end. Chapter 20. Whether fortresses and other things which princes often make are useful or injurious. Some princes, in order to securely hold their possessions, have disarmed their subjects. Some others have kept their subject lands divided into parts. Others have fomented enmities against themselves. Others have endeavored to win over those whom they suspected at the commencement of their rule. Some have constructed fortresses, others have ruined and destroyed them. And although one cannot pronounce a definite judgment as to these things without going into the particulars of the state to which such a deliberation is to be applied, still I will speak in such a broad way as the matter will permit of. A new prince has never been known to disarm his subjects. On the contrary, when he has found them disarmed, he has always armed them. For by arming them, these arms become your own. Those that you suspected become faithful, and those that were faithful remain so, and from being merely subjects become your partisans. And since all the subjects cannot be armed, when you benefit those that you arm, you can deal more safely with the others. And this different treatment that they notice renders your men more obliged to you. The others will excuse you, judging that those have necessarily greater merit who have greater danger and heavier duties. But when you disarm them, you commence to offend them and show that you distrust them either through cowardice or lack of confidence. And both of these opinions generate hatred against you. And as you cannot remain unarmed, you are obliged to resort to a mercenary militia, of which we have already stated the value. And even if it were good, it cannot be sufficient in number to defend you against powerful enemies and suspected subjects. But, as I have said, a new prince in a new dominion always has his subjects armed. History is full of such examples. But when a prince acquires a new state as an addition to his old one, then it is necessary to disarm that state, except those who in acquiring it have sided with you. And even these one must, when time and opportunity serve, render weak and effeminate, and arrange things so that all the arms of the new state are in the hands of your own soldiers who in your old state live near you. Our forefathers and those who were esteemed wise used to say that it was necessary to hold Pistoia by means of Factius and Pisa with fortresses, and for this purpose they fomented differences among their subjects in some town in order to possess it more easily. This in those days when Italy was fairly divided was doubtless well done, but does not seem to me to be a good precept for the present time, for I do not believe that the divisions thus created ever do any good. On the contrary, it is certain that when the enemy approaches, the cities thus divided will be at once lost, for the weaker faction will always side with the enemy, and the other will not be able to stand. The Venetians, actuated, I believe, by the aforesaid motives, cherished the Guelph and Ghibelline factions in the cities subject to them, and although they never allowed them to come to bloodshed, they yet encouraged these differences among them, so that the citizens, being occupied in their own quarrels, might not act against them. This, however, did not avail them anything, as was seen when, after the defeat of Vaila, a part of those subjects immediately took courage and took from them the whole state. Such methods besides argue weakness in a prince, for in a strong government such dissensions will never be permitted. They are profitable only in time of peace, as by means of them it is easy to manage one's subjects. But when it comes to war, the fallacy of such a policy is at once shown. Without doubt, princes become great when they overcome difficulties in opposition, and therefore fortune, especially when it wants to render a new prince great, who has greater need of gaining a great reputation than a hereditary prince, raises up enemies and compels him to undertake wars against them, so that he may have cause to overcome them, and thus raise himself higher by means of that ladder which his enemies have brought him. There are many who think therefore that a wise prince ought, when he has the chance, to foment astutely some enmity, so that by suppressing it he will augment his greatness. Princes, and especially new ones, have found more faith and more usefulness in those men, whom at the beginning of their power they regarded with suspicion than in those they at first confided in. Pandolfo Petrucci, Prince of Siena, governed his state more by those whom he suspected than by others, but of this we cannot speak at large, as it varies according to the subject. I will merely say that these men who at the beginning of a new government were enemies, if they are of a kind to need support to maintain their position, can be very easily gained by the prince, and they are the more compelled to serve him faithfully as they know they must, by their deeds, cancel the bad opinion previously held of them, and thus the prince will always derive greater help from them than from those who, serving him with greater security, neglect his interest. And as the matter requires it, I will not omit to remind a prince who has newly taken a state with the secret help of its inhabitants, that he must consider well the motives that have induced those who have favored him to do so, and if it is not natural affection for him, but only because they were not contented with the state as it was, he will have great trouble and difficulty in maintaining their friendship, because it will be impossible for him to content them. And on well examining the cause of this in the examples drawn from ancient and modern times, it will be seen that it is much easier to gain the friendship of those men who were contented with the previous condition and were therefore at first enemies, than that of those who, not being contented, became his friends and helped him to occupy it. It has been the custom of princes, in order to be able to hold securely their state, to erect fortresses as a bridle and bit to those who have designs against them, and in order to have a secure refuge against a sudden assault. I approve this method because it was anciently used. Nevertheless, Messer Niccolò Vitelli has been seen in our own time to destroy 2 fortresses in Città di Castello in order to keep that state. Guidobaldo, Duke of Urbino, on returning to his dominions from which he had been driven by Cesare Borgia, razed to their foundations all the fortresses of that province, and considered that without them it would be more difficult for him to lose again the state. The Bentivogli, in returning to Bologna, used similar measures. Therefore, fortresses may or may not be useful according to the times. If they do good in one way, they do harm in another. The question may be discussed thus. A prince who fears his own people more than foreigners ought to build fortresses, but he who has greater fear of foreigners than of his own people ought to do without them. The castle of Milan, built by Francesco Sforza, has given and will give more trouble to the house of Sforza than any other disorder in that state. Therefore, the best fortress is to be found in the love of the people. For although you may have fortresses, they will not save you if you are hated by the people. When once the people have taken arms against you, there will never be lacking foreigners to assist them. In our times, we do not see that they have profited any ruler, except the Countess of Forli on the death of her consort, Count Girolamo, for she was thus enabled to escape the popular rising and await help from Milan and recover the state, the circumstances being then such that no foreigner could assist the people. But afterwards they were of little use to her when Cesare Borgia attacked her, and the people being hostile to her allied themselves with the foreigner. So that then and before it would have been safer for her not to be hated by the people than to have the fortresses. Having considered these things, I would therefore praise the one who erects fortresses and the one who does not, and would blame anyone who, trusting in them, thinks little of being hated by his people. Chapter 21. How a prince must act in order to gain reputation. Nothing causes a prince to be so much esteemed as great enterprises and setting a rare example. We have in our own day Ferdinand, King of Aragon, at present King of Spain. He may almost be termed a new prince, because from a weak king he has become, for fame and glory, the first king in Christendom, and if you regard his actions, you will find them all very great, and some of them extraordinary. At the beginning of his reign, he assailed Granada, and that enterprise was the foundation of his state. At first he did it leisurely and without fear of being interfered with. He kept the minds of the barons of Castile occupied in this enterprise, so that thinking only of that war, they did not think of making innovations, and he thus acquired reputation and power over them without their being aware of it. He was able with the money of the church and the people to maintain his armies, and by that long war lay the foundations of his military power, which afterwards has made him famous. Besides this, to be able to undertake greater enterprises, and always under the pretext of religion, he had recourse to a pious cruelty, driving out the Moors from his kingdom and despoiling them. No more admirable or rare example can be found. He also attacked under the same pretext Africa, undertook his Italian enterprise, and has lately attacked France. so that he has continually contrived great things, which have kept his subjects' minds uncertain and astonished, and occupied in watching their result. And these actions have arisen one out of the other, so that they have left no time for men to settle down and act against him. It is also very profitable for a prince to give some rare examples of himself in the internal administration, like those related of Messer Bernabo of Milan, when it happens that someone does something extraordinary, either good or evil, in civil life, and to take a means of rewarding or punishing him, which will be much talked about. And above all, a prince must endeavor in every action to obtain fame for being great and excellent. A prince is further esteemed when he is a true friend or a true enemy, when, that is, he declares himself without reserve in favor of someone against another. This policy is always more useful than remaining neutral, for if two neighboring powers come to blows, they are either such that if one wins, you will have to fear the victor or else not. In either of these two cases, it will be better for you to declare yourself openly and make war, because in the first case, if you do not declare yourself, you will fall a prey to the victor, to the pleasure and satisfaction of the one who has been defeated, and you will have no reason nor anything to defend you and nobody to receive you. For whoever wins will not desire friends whom he suspects and who do not help him when in trouble. And whoever loses will not receive you, as you did not take up arms to assist his cause. Antiochus went to Greece, being sent by the Aetoli to expel the Romans. He sent orators to the Achaii, who were friends of the Romans, to encourage them to remain neutral. On the other hand, the Romans persuaded them to take up arms on their side. The matter was brought before the council of the Achaii for deliberation, where the ambassador of Antiochus sought to persuade them to remain neutral, to which the Roman ambassador replied, "As to what is said that it is best and most useful for your state not to meddle in our war, nothing is further from the truth. For if you do not meddle in it, you will become, without any favor or any reputation, the prize of the victor. And it will always happen that the one who is not your friend will want you to remain neutral, and the one who is your friend will require you to declare yourself by taking arms. Irresolute princes, to avoid present dangers, usually follow the way of neutrality and are mostly ruined by it. But when the prince declares himself frankly in favor of one side, if the one to whom you adhere conquers, even if he is powerful and you remain at his discretion, he is under an obligation to you, and friendship has been established, and men are never so dishonest as to oppress you with such ingratitude. Moreover, victories are never so prosperous that the victor does not need to have some scruples, especially as to justice. But if he to whom you adhere loses, you are sheltered by him, and so long as he can, he will assist you. You become the companion of a fortune which may rise again. In the second case, when those who fight are such that you have nothing to fear from the victor, it is still more prudent on your part to adhere to one. For you go to the ruin of one with the help of him who ought to save him if he were wise, and if he conquers, he rests at your discretion, and it is impossible that he should not conquer with your help. And here it should be noted that a prince ought never to make common cause with one more powerful than himself to injure another, unless necessity forces him to it, as before said. For if he wins, you rest at his discretion, and princes must avoid as much as possible being at the discretion of others. The Venetians united with France against the Duke of Milan, although they could have avoided that union, and from it resulted their own ruin. But when one cannot avoid it, as happened to the Florentines when the Pope and Spain went with their armies to attack Lombardy, then the prince ought to join for the above reasons. Let no state believe that it can follow a secure policy. Rather, let it think that all are doubtful. This is found in the nature of things, that one never tries to avoid one difficulty without running into another. But prudence consists in being able to know the nature of the difficulties and taking the least harmful as good. A prince must also show himself a lover of merit and honor those who excel in every art. Moreover, he must encourage his citizens to follow their callings quietly, whether in commerce or agriculture or any other trade that men follow, so that this one shall not refrain from improving his possessions through fear that they may be taken from him, and that one from starting a trade for fear of taxes. But he should offer rewards to whoever does these things, and to whoever seeks in any way to improve his city or state. Besides this, he ought, at convenient seasons of the year, to keep the people occupied with festivals and spectacles. And as every city is divided either into trades or into classes, he ought to pay attention to all these things, mingle with them from time to time, and give them an example of his humanity and magnificence, always holding firm, however, the majesty of his dignity, which must never be allowed to fan in anything whatever. Chapter 22. Of the Secretaries of Princes. The choice of a prince's ministers is a matter of no little importance. They are either good or not, according to the prudence of the prince. The first impression that one gets of a ruler and of his brains is from seeing the men that he has about him. When they are competent and faithful, one can always consider him wise, as he has been able to recognize their ability and keep them faithful. But when they are the reverse, one can always form an unfavorable opinion of him, because the first mistake that he makes is in making this choice. There was nobody who knew Messer Antonio da Venafro as the minister of Pandolfo Petrucci, Prince of Siena, who did not consider Pandolfo to be a very prudent man, having him for his minister. There are three different kinds of brains. The one understands things unassisted, the other understands things when shown by others. The third understands neither alone nor with the explanations of others. The first kind is most excellent, the second also excellent, but the third useless. It is therefore evident that if Pandolfo was not of the first kind, he was at any rate of the second. For every time that one has the judgment to know the good and evil that anyone does or says, even if he has no invention, yet he recognizes the bad and good works of his minister and corrects the one and supports the other, and the minister cannot hope to deceive him and therefore remains good. For a prince to be able to know a minister, there is this method which never fails. When you see the minister, think more of himself than of you, and in all his actions seek his own profit. Such a man will never be a good minister, and you can never rely on him. For whoever has in hand the state of another must never think of himself but of the prince, and not call to mind anything but what relates to him. And, on the other hand, the prince, in order to retain his fidelity, ought to think of his minister, honoring and enriching him, doing him kindnesses, and conferring on him honors and giving him responsible tasks, so that the great honors and riches bestowed on him cause him not to desire other honors and riches. And the tasks he has to fulfill make him fearful of changes, knowing that he could not execute them without the prince. When princes and their ministers stand in this relation to each other, they can rely the one upon the other. When it is otherwise, the end is always injurious either for one or the other of them. Chapter 23. How flatterers must be shunned. I must not omit an important subject, and a mistake which princes can with difficulty avoid if they are not very prudent or if they do not make a good choice. And this is with regard to flatterers, of which courts are full, because men take such pleasure in their own things and deceive themselves about them that they can with difficulty guard against this plague. And by wishing to guard against it, they run the risk of becoming contemptible, because there is no other way of guarding oneself against flattery than by letting men understand that they will not offend you by speaking the truth. But when everyone can tell you the truth, you lose their respect. A prudent prince must therefore take a third course, by choosing in his state wise men, and in giving these alone full liberty to speak the truth to him, but only of those things that he asks and of nothing else. But he must ask them about everything and hear their opinion, and afterwards deliberate by himself in his own way, and in these councils and with each of these men comport himself, so that everyone may see that the more freely he speaks, the more he will be acceptable. Outside these he should listen to no one, go about the matter deliberately, and be determined in his decisions. Whoever acts otherwise either acts precipitately through flattery, or else changes often through the variety of opinions, from which it happens that he is little esteemed. I will give a modern instance of this. Pray Luca, a follower of Maximilian, the present emperor, speaking of his majesty, said that he never took counsel with anybody, and yet that he never did anything as he wished. This arose from his following the contrary method to the aforesaid. As the emperor is a secret man, he does not communicate his designs to anyone or take anyone's advice, but as on putting them into effect they begin to be known and discovered, They begin to be opposed by those he has about him, and he is easily diverted from his purpose. Hence it comes to pass that what he does one day, he undoes the next. No one ever understands what he wishes or intends to do, and no reliance is to be placed on his deliberations. A prince, therefore, ought always to take counsel, but only when he wishes, not when others wish. On the contrary, he ought to discourage absolutely attempts to advise him unless he asks it. But he ought to be a great asker and a patient hearer of the truth about those things which he has inquired of. Indeed, if he finds that anyone has scruples in telling him the truth, he should be angry. And since some think that a prince who gains the reputation of being prudent is so considered, not by his nature but by the good counselors he has about him, they are undoubtedly deceived. It is an infallible rule that a prince who is not wise himself can't be well advised, unless by chance he left himself entirely in the hands of one man who ruled him in everything, and happened to be a very prudent man. In this case, he may doubtless be well governed, but it would not last long, for that governor would in a short time deprive him of the state. But by taking counsel with many, a prince who is not wise will never have united counsels and will not be able to unite them for himself. The counselors will all think of their own interests, and he will be unable either to correct or to understand them. And it cannot be otherwise, for men will always be false to you unless they are compelled by necessity to be true. Therefore, it must be concluded that wise counsels, from whoever they come, must necessarily be due to the prudence of the prince, and not to the prudence of the prince to the good counsels received. Chapter 24. Why the princes of Italy have lost their states. The before-mentioned things, if prudently observed, make a new prince seem ancient, and render him at once more secure and firmer in the state than if he had been established there of old. For a new prince is much more observed in his actions than a hereditary one. And when these are recognized as virtuous, he gains men more, and they are more bound to him than if he were of the ancient blood. For men are much more taken by present than by past things, and when they find themselves well off in the present, they enjoy it and seek nothing more. On the contrary, they will do all they can to defend him, so long as the prince is not in other things wanting to himself. And thus he will have the double glory of having founded a new realm, and adorned it and fortified it with good laws, good arms, good friends, and good examples. As he will have double shame who is born a prince, and through want of prudence has lost it. And if one considers those rulers who have lost their position in Italy in our days, such as the King of Naples, the Duque of Milan, and others, one will find in them first a common defect as to their arms, for the reasons discussed at length. Then we observe that some of them either had the people hostile to them, or that if the people were friendly, they were not able to make sure of the nobility. For without these defects, states are not lost that have enough strength to be able to keep an army in the field. Philip of Macedon, not the father of Alexander the Great, but the one who was conquered by Titus Quintius, did not possess a great state compared to the greatness of Rome and Greece which assailed him. But being a military man and one who knew how to divert the people and make sure of the great, he was able to sustain the war against them for many years. And if at length he lost his power over several cities, he was still able to keep his kingdom. Therefore, those of our princes who had held their possessions for many years must not accuse fortune for having lost them, but rather their own negligence. For having never in quiet times considered that things might change, as it is a common fault of men not to reckon on storms in fair weather, when adverse times came, they only thought of fleeing from them, instead of defending themselves, and hoped that the people, enraged by the insolence of the conquerors, would recall them. This measure, when others are wanting, is good, but it is very bad to have neglected the other remedies for that one, for nobody would desire to fall because he believed that he would then find someone to pick him up. This may or may not take place, and if it does, it is not with safety to you, as that defense is known to be cowardly and not to be depended on. And only those defenses are good, certain, and durable, which depend only on yourself and your own ability. Chapter 25. How much fortune can do in human affairs and how it may be opposed. It is not unknown to me how many have been and are of opinion that worldly events are so governed by fortune and by God, that men cannot by their prudence change them, and that on the contrary there is no remedy whatever, and for this they may judge it to be useless to toil much about them, but let things be ruled by chance. This opinion has been more believed in our day, from the great changes that have been seen, and are daily seen, beyond every human conjecture. When I think about them at times, I am partly inclined to share this opinion. Nevertheless, that our free will may not be altogether extinguished, I think it may be true that fortune is the ruler of half our actions, but that she allows the other half, or a little less, to be governed by us. I would compare her to an impetuous river that, when turbulent, inundates the plains, ruins trees and buildings, removes earth from this side, and places it on the other. Everyone flies before it, and everything yields to its fury without being able to oppose it. And yet, though it is of such a kind, still when it is quiet, men can make provision against it by dams and banks, so that, when it rises, it will either go into a canal, or its rush will not be so wild and dangerous. It happens similarly with fortune, which shows her power where no measures have been taken to resist her, and turns her fury where she knows that no dams or barriers have been made to hold her. And if you regard Italy, which has been the seat of these changes, and who has given the impulse to them, you will see her to be a country without dams or barriers of any kind. If she had been protected by proper measures like Germany, Spain, and France, this inundation would not have caused the great changes that it has, or would not have happened at all. This must suffice as regards opposition to fortune in general. But limiting myself more to particular cases, I would point out how one sees a certain prince today fortunate and tomorrow ruined, without seeing that he has changed in character or otherwise. I believe this arises in the first place from the causes that we have already discussed at length. That is to say, because the prince who bases himself entirely on fortune is ruined when fortune varies. I also believe that he is happy whose mode of proceeding accords with the needs of the times, and similarly, he is unfortunate whose mode of proceeding is opposed to the times. For one sees that men in those things which lead them to the aim that each one has in view, namely, glory and riches, proceed in various ways, one with circumspection, another with impetuosity, one by violence, another by cunning, one with patience, another with the reverse, and each by these diverse ways may arrive at his aim. One sees also two cautious men, one of whom succeeds in his designs, and the other not, and in the same way two men succeed equally by different methods, one being cautious, the other impetuous, which arises only from the nature of the times, which does or does not conform to their method of proceeding. From this results, as I have said, that two men, acting differently, attain the same effect, and of two others acting in the same way, one arrives at his good and not the other. From this depend also the changes in fortune, for if it happens that time and circumstances are favorable to one who acts with caution and prudence, he will be successful, but if time and circumstances change, he will be ruined, because he does not change his mode of proceeding. No man is found able to adapt himself to this, either because he cannot deviate from that to which his nature disposes him, or else because, having always prospered by walking in one path, he cannot persuade himself that it is well to leave it, and therefore the cautious man, when it is time to act suddenly, does not know how to do so and is consequently ruined. For if one could change one's nature with time and circumstances, fortune would never change. Pope Julius II acted impetuously in everything he did, and found the times and conditions so in conformity with that mode of proceeding that he always obtained a good result. Consider the first war that he made against Bologna, while Messer Giovanni Bentivogli was still living. The Venetians were not pleased with it. The King of Spain and likewise France had objections to this enterprise, notwithstanding which with his fierce and impetuous disposition he engaged personally in the expedition. This move caused both Spain and the Venetians to halt and hesitate, the latter through fear, the former through the desire to regain the entire kingdom of Naples. On the other hand, he engaged with him the King of France, because seeing him make this move, in desiring his friendship in order to put down the Venetians, that king judged that he could not refuse him his troops without manifest injury. Thus Julius, by his impetuous move, achieved what no other pontiff with the utmost human prudence would have succeeded in doing, because if he had waited till all arrangements had been made and everything settled before leaving Rome, as any other pontiff would have done, it would never have taken place. For the King of France would have found 1,000 excuses, and the others would have inspired him with 1,000 fears. I will omit his other actions, which were all of this kind, and which all succeeded well, and the shortness of his life did not suffer him to experience the contrary. For had time succeeded in which it was necessary to act with caution, his ruin would have resulted, for he would never have deviated from these methods to which his nature disposed him. I conclude then that fortune varying and men remaining fixed in their ways, they are successful so long as these ways conform to each other, but when they are opposed to each other, then they are unsuccessful. I certainly think that it is better to be impetuous than cautious, for fortune is a woman, and it is necessary, if you wish to master her, to conquer her by force, and it can be seen that she lets herself be overcome by these rather than by those who proceed coldly, and therefore, like a woman, she is a friend to the young, because they are less cautious, fiercer, and master her with greater audacity. Chapter 26. Exhortation to liberate Italy from the barbarians. Having now considered all the things we have spoken of, and thought within myself whether at present the time was not propitious in Italy for a new prince, and if there was not a state of things which offered an opportunity to a prudent and capable man to introduce a new system that would do honor to himself and good to the mass of the people, it seems to me that so many things concur to favor a new ruler that I do not know of any time more fitting for such an enterprise. And if, as I said, it was necessary in order that the power of Moses should be displayed, that the people of Israel should be slaves in Egypt, and to give scope for the greatness and courage of Cyrus that the Persians should be oppressed by the Medes, and to illustrate the preeminence of Theseus that the Athenians should be dispersed, so at the present time, in order that the might of an Italian genius might be recognized, it was necessary that Italy should be reduced to her present condition, and that she should be more enslaved than the Hebrews, more oppressed than the Persians, and more scattered than the Athenians, without a head, without order, beaten, despoiled, lacerated, and overrun, and that she should have suffered ruin of every kind. And although before now a spirit has been shown by some, which gave hope that he might be appointed by God for her redemption, yet at the highest summit of his career he was thrown aside by fortune, so that now, almost lifeless, she awaits one who may heal her wounds and put a stop to the rapine and pillaging of Lombardy, to the rapacity and extortion in the kingdom and in Tuscany, and cure her of those sores which have long been festering. Behold how she prays God to send someone to redeem her from this barbarous cruelty and insolence. Behold her ready and willing to follow any standard, if only there be someone to raise it. There is nothing now she can hope for, but that your illustrious house may place itself at the head of this redemption, being by its power and fortune so exalted, and being favored by God and the Church, whose leadership it now occupies. Nor will this be very difficult to you, if you call to mind the actions and lives of the men I have named. And although those men were rare and marvelous, they were none the less men, and had each of them less occasion than the present, for their enterprise was not juster than this, nor easier, nor was God more their friend than he is yours. Here is a just cause, for that war is just which is necessary, and those arms are merciful where no hope exists save in them. Here is the greatest willingness, nor can there be great difficulty where there is great willingness, provided that the measures are adopted of those whom I have set before you as examples. Besides this, unexampled wonders have been seen here performed by God. The sea has been opened, a cloud has shown you the road, the rock has given forth water, manna has rained, and everything has contributed to your greatness. The remainder must be done by you. God will not do everything in order not to deprive us of free will and the portion of the glory that falls to our lot. It is no marvel that none of the before-mentioned Italians have done that which it is to be hoped your illustrious house may do. And if in so many revolutions in Italy and so many warlike operations, it always seems as if the military capacity were extinct, This is because the ancient methods were not good, and no one has arisen who knew how to discover new ones. Nothing does so much honor to a newly risen man than the new laws and measures which he introduces. These things, when they are well-based and have greatness in them, render him revered and admired, and there is not lacking scope in Italy for the introduction of every kind. Here there is great virtue in the members, if it were not wanting in the heads. Look how, in duels and in councils of a few, the Italians are superior in strength, dexterity, and intelligence. But when it comes to armies, they make a poor show, which proceeds entirely from the weakness of the leaders. For those that know are not obedient, and everyone thinks that he knows, there being hitherto nobody who has raised himself so high both by valor and fortune as to make the others yield. Hence it comes about that in all this time, in all the wars waged during the last 20 years, whenever there has been an army entirely Italian, it has always been a failure. As witness first Taro, then Alexandria, Capua, Genoa, Vaila, Bologna, and Mestre. If your illustrious house, therefore, wishes to follow those great men who redeemed their countries, it is before all things necessary, as the true foundation of every undertaking, to provide yourself with your own forces, for you cannot have more faithful or truer and better soldiers. And although each one of them may be good, they will together become better when they see themselves commanded by their prince and honored and supported by him. It is therefore necessary to prepare such forces in order to be able with Italian prowess to defend the country from foreigners. And although both the Swiss and Spanish infantry are deemed terrible, nonetheless they each have their defects, so that a third order might not only oppose them, but be confident of overcoming them. For the Spaniards cannot sustain the attack of cavalry, and the Swiss have to fear infantry, which meets them with resolution equal to their own. From which it has resulted, as will be seen by experience, that the Spaniards cannot sustain the attack of French cavalry, and the Swiss are overthrown by Spanish infantry. And although a complete example of the latter has not been seen, yet an instance was furnished in the Battle of Ravenna, where the Spanish infantry attacked the German battalions, which observed the same order as the Swiss. The Spaniards, through their bodily agility and aided by their bucklers, had entered between and under their pikes, and were in a position to attack them safely without the Germans being able to defend themselves. And if the cavalry had not charged them, they would have utterly destroyed them. Knowing therefore the defects of both these kinds of infantry, a third kind can be created which can resist cavalry and need not fear infantry. And this will be done not by the creation of armies, but by a change of system. And these are the things which, when newly introduced, give reputation and grandeur to a new prince. This opportunity must not therefore be allowed to pass, for letting Italy at length see her liberator. I cannot express the love with which he would be received in all those provinces which have suffered under these foreign invasions. With what thirst for vengeance, with what steadfast faith, with what love, with what grateful tears. What doors would be closed against him? What people would refuse him obedience? What envy could oppose him? What Italian would rebel against him? This barbarous domination stinks in the nostrils of everyone. May your illustrious house therefore assume this task with that courage and those hopes which are inspired by a just cause, so that under its banner our fatherland may be raised up, and under its auspices be verified that saying of Petrarch, "Valor against fell wrath will take up arms, and be the combat quickly sped. For sure the ancient worth that in Italians stirs the heart is not yet dead." The end. Best Audiobooks for Free hopes that you have enjoyed this production of The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli. Please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and Rumble, as your subscription is the support we need to create more great free content. Please look to our website at bestaudiobooksforfree.com for a complete list of our audiobooks.